Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered the military on Tuesday to immediately carry out what is called powerful attacks in Gaza. Let's go live now to Hamdah Salhut in the Jordanian capital, because Israel has banned Al Jazeera from reporting there. Hamdah, what are you hearing? Because we do have a ceasefire in place.
Well, the Israeli Prime Minister's office just releasing a statement on X saying that following consultations with the security echelon, the Prime Minister has instructed the military to immediately carry out powerful strikes on the Gaza Strip. It's unclear when they're going to take place. It's unclear where they are going to target. But the Israelis say this is in response to what they're calling Hamas's ceasefire violations by not handing over the bodies of the remaining 13 captives that are still inside of Gaza. Now, Hamas has said for some time they need assistance on the ground in the form of specialized teams, in the form of heavy machinery. And within the last couple of days, Israel has allowed that in, but still they have not exhumed all of the bodies. But at the end of the day, mediators knew this was the case. The Israeli officials who were involved in these discussions knew that this was also going to be the situation. And the Americans, including President Donald Trump himself, knew that it was going to be a difficult task to try and find and exhume all of the bodies of the hostages that are buried under the rubble, because there are millions of tons of it inside of the Gaza Strip. But the Israelis say that they have been fed up with Hamas's inability to bring back those bodies, and therefore Netanyahu held a discussion earlier on in the day on Tuesday about how Israel was going to respond. And now it seems we have that response, that they are going to be carrying out powerful airstrikes, but it's still unclear when exactly that's going to take place. But the military says it is going to be quite immediate.
Well, I wonder if those powerful strikes would be a massive breach that could potentially end this very fragile ceasefire, Hamdah. But can you give us some context, please? Because this seems to have escalated since the handover of the latest body, which was handed overnight, not the one that Hamas has found in the last few hours, but we're talking about the remains, let's say, of one of the Israeli captives that had been held after the October 7 attack.
So since the ceasefire came into effect on October 10th, Hamas did not hand over all of the bodies of those deceased captives inside of Gaza, but said they were working on it and would do it as quickly as they could, however many bodies and remains they could find. Now, this is not the first time that Israel says the remains were not of an Israeli captive. It happened once before, just last week, saying that one of those bodies that was handed over was actually not that of an Israeli captive. And the remains that were handed over last night on Monday, Israel says, were remains, additional ones of a captive whose remains were already taken by Israeli forces and brought back to Israel back in December of 2023 during a military operation. So Israel says this is a huge breach of the ceasefire already, and that they want to respond to that. Now, there have been accusations back and forth about breaching the deal, about not honoring commitments related to it, but you have to remember this was an incredibly fragile situation to begin with, and the United States came in as a mediator alongside Egypt, alongside Qatar, and there are also nearly 60 other countries who are backing this deal, wanting to make sure that it is in place. Now, previously, when Israel struck Gaza just last week on Sunday, they had said that it was in response to a Hamas attack in southern Gaza on Israeli troops. Hamas denied that attack, but Israel carried out airstrikes across the Gaza Strip, saying that they were targeting Hamas operatives and fighters. But the Americans, when they had spoken to the Israelis, said that they had the right to respond to any sort of ceasefire, any sort of breach of that deal, but that they needed to show restraint because they didn't want the deal overall to fall apart. So this is surely something that is, I don't want to say unprecedented because it is a fragile ceasefire, but it's going to be interesting to see where it goes, because the U.S. doesn't want this deal to fall apart. Both Israel and Hamas say that they are committed to the deal, but Israel says that Hamas is not really honoring its end of the commitment.
Yeah, and on top of that, you have the families of those that are held captive that this morning said they wanted to have a conversation with Netanyahu as to what he will do to ensure that those that are held captive, the bodies, of course, those that are not living anymore, for them to be returned as soon as possible.
So there's been a chain of pressure within the last 10 to 15 days. The family members of those hostages who are deceased, whose remains are still in Gaza, they're putting pressure on the Israeli government for answers. The Israelis are then putting pressure on the Americans to try and respond to what they're calling Hamas's ceasefire violations. The Americans then put pressure on the Israelis to allow the specialized teams on the ground and the heavy machinery and equipment to search in places beyond that yellow line, beyond the area of which Israeli forces have withdrawn from, so places that are still technically under Israeli control inside of Gaza. Israel then allowed all of this so that more bodies could be exhumed. But Israel says the results are not really what they are looking for. It's not happening at a fast enough pace. And the family members of those captives just a couple of days ago called on the government to not discuss anything relating to phase 2 of Trump's 20-point peace plan until all of the remaining bodies of captives are brought back to Israel. Netanyahu himself, along with several Israeli officials, have said that they don't really want to talk about next steps or the next phases of the deal, because how can they do that when phase 1 isn't even complete, when all of the bodies of those captives haven't been brought back? But many who are behind this deal want to see it through. Not many, all of them, in fact, have given a lot of effort to try and secure this deal and say that they don't want to see it collapse. And one of those people is U.S. President Donald Trump, who brokered this deal in the first place. So there are a lot of moving parts here. There is a lot going on, but the Americans certainly do not want to see this deal collapse. And there was word within the Trump administration that several officials who spoke anonymously to American media were concerned that Netanyahu was going to walk away from the deal, that he was essentially going to torpedo the agreement altogether, that it was completely going to collapse because he would want to go back to war given the pressure within his right-wing coalition. So you also have that added factor about Netanyahu and his political survival, which depends on those right-wing allies, and you can be sure that they are certainly going to be supportive of a return to the fighting, despite a majority of Israelis, those who are in the government and the general Israeli public who's been protesting against that government, do not want to go back to the fighting.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, just to quote the mother of Ofer Zarfati, that was the remains of the person that was sent over to Israel, saying, how can you bury your child in installments? And that's why there has been fury over that. Now, you just mentioned there the far-right ministers in Netanyahu's government. You know, they have been wanting to go back to the war, but they have been receiving pushback, it seems, from Netanyahu, perhaps because of the US pressure to make this go through.
There is certainly pushback from Netanyahu against those right-wing members who want to go back to war, because remember, these are people in the government who didn't want a deal to begin with. They were against a ceasefire. They were against giving up any sort of territory that Israel captured. They were against all of these ideas because their vision for what Gaza would look like was completely different than what Netanyahu has said publicly was Israel's policy. They wanted to occupy and take over the entirety of the Gaza Strip. They wanted to build illegal settlements there, something they are still advocating for to this day. And they wanted to forcibly expel the Palestinian population there and essentially take the entirety of the Palestinian population and annex it. That is what they wanted to do. That is the right-wing aspiration within Netanyahu's government. But the Israeli premier has said publicly on the record many times that that's not Israel's policy, because of course it would anger much of the world and those who are allies with Israel. But because of the American pressure that has been put on Netanyahu, it essentially left him with no choice. And those are the words of Donald Trump himself, who said Netanyahu had no other choice but to accept this deal because Israel was increasingly isolated in the world. They were becoming a political pariah. And then Donald Trump knew that it was essentially going to be his job to fix Israel's standing within the international community because of the outcry, because of the potential sanctions, because of the isolation that Israel was put in politically, economically, on the arts front, and in many other sectors and factors. So that sort of pressure is eventually what swayed Netanyahu into accepting this deal, knowing that there was no other choice but to take this path, despite the cries from the far right not to take it, and those who are threatening to torpedo the entire government, to make it collapse, sending the country into snap elections.
All right, thank you very much for the moment. That is Hamdah Salhut. Of course, we will be speaking to you once again at some point for this latest breaking news line that we have now when it comes to Israel. But let's go to Hind Khoudary. She's live for us in Deir el-Balah in central Gaza. So I'm not sure how people, whether they have heard the news yet, but how are they responding for those that have?
Of course, Palestinians heard the news. This is something that is widely circulating right now, and people are actually very frustrated. They do not know when these airstrikes and the series of airstrikes are going to start, who's going to be killed, who's going to be targeted. And as you know, Sarah, there's no place safe across the Gaza Strip. So Palestinians knew this ceasefire is very fragile, and they were also very scared since the incident that happened in Rafah took place, and they were expecting this. This is not the first time an incident happens and then the Israeli forces start carrying their attacks. The last time there was a couple of airstrikes in Zawaida, and there was also a Palestinian journalist who was killed. But now Palestinians are here frustrated, waiting, and very traumatized. Who's going to be killed next? And Sarah, Palestinians don't want to go through this again and again and again. They have lived 2 years of endless bombardment, relentless bombardment, losing everything they have, losing their family members, their beloved ones. And now, after ceasefire, this happens. This is definitely something Palestinians do not want. We are hearing very loud drones in the sky. There has been continuous explosions in the eastern parts of Khan Yunis and Rafah, but still these series of airstrikes did not start yet. But also Palestinians do not know, is this the reason? What's the reason behind this? Is it the incident that took place in Rafah? Or is it the fact that the Israeli authorities have been blaming Hamas, that they're delaying the release and the retrievement of the Israeli captives? There are a lot of stories, and it's obviously one of those nights where Palestinians won't sleep due to the intense explosions.
I can imagine they must be very worried. Just stay there, Hind, because I want to read out that Prime Minister Office's announcement. He says, following security consultations, Prime Minister Netanyahu has directed the military to immediately carry out forceful strikes in the Gaza Strip. And that's the key word there, forceful. It's not clear to what degree or where, as you mentioned. What we do know is it's because of its accusations against Hamas, it says, of repeated violations throughout this ceasefire. Now, on the one hand, we did hear from Hamdah, it could potentially be because of the delays with the bodies being handed over of the captives, but also we know that there has been reports of gunfire in Rafah earlier today. What can you tell us about that?
So the incident took place in Rafah. Let me also highlight the fact that Rafah is actually in the yellow line where Palestinians are unable to reach that area. So people don't know what is happening there. People could not reach that area. So we just heard that there's an exchange of fire in Rafah, and then airstrikes and bombs started happening in the eastern part. So we don't really know what really happened, who started, what started this exchange of fire. But this is not the first incident, as I mentioned, Sarah. This happened before, where an incident took place and an Israeli soldier was injured. And then the Israeli forces resumed their attacks against Gaza. Now, what we really need to know is Palestinians now are terrified. They don't know if these attacks are going to be attacking the north, the south, the middle area. Everyone's waiting. And as you hear, Sarah, the drones are very, very loud.
Yeah, certainly louder than we have heard them for days. It will be interesting to see whether Hamas does delay the handover now of this latest body that it was due, you mentioned earlier, due to be handed over at 8 p.m. local time. So the verdict remains to be seen on that. Can you please remind us, this wouldn't be the first Israeli violation, at least, since the ceasefire started. Give us a reminder of what happened.
Sarah, we're talking about at least 90 Palestinians that have been killed since the ceasefire started. Let me remind you of the attack on Abu Sha'ban family, where 11 Palestinians have been killed. And the Israelis said that they crossed the yellow line, but there was no clear sign of where the yellow line was. There was also an attack on Zawaida, on the entrance of one of the cafes, where at least 4 Palestinians have been killed, and we're talking about numbers of others that have been injured. There was also an attack on one of where journalists have been broadcasting, where the journalist Ahmed Abu Mtair and the son of journalist Abu Bashar Zanin were also killed, and all of these happened in the past couple of days. Now, what we also know is the fact that there has been an agreement that 600 trucks of humanitarian aid was supposed to enter. We're also seeing at least 90 trucks of humanitarian aid that enter every single day. So there's a lot of violations. The agreement is not what is happening on the ground. There are also endless attacks on Palestinians, and always they say that they crossed the yellow line. Yes, there has been blocks where these blocks are showing where this yellow line is, but not in all areas. Palestinians go there to check up on their houses, on their properties, to see, but they are always being injured and shot by the Israeli forces. Also, the fact that Palestinians thought that there will be a Rafah crossing opening during this phase, where the Israeli forces said, no, we won't open the crossing until all of the Israeli captives' bodies are going to be handed. So what is happening on the ground is very frustrating for Palestinians. They do not know where they stand now, and they believe that this ceasefire is very fragile. There has been continuous violations. We're talking about at least 90 Palestinians who that were killed. There are very limited numbers of trucks that have been entering. Humanitarian aid is very little compared to what the huge and high demand of Palestinians. So Palestinians have been living this for the past 3 weeks since the ceasefire started, but they're saying that there's no change on the ground. The humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate. The health situation is still collapsing, and there's no change on the ground, Sarah.
And Hind, Israel is accusing Hamas, it says, of delaying the release of the bodies of captives. It says it has intelligence that Hamas knows where a lot of the remaining bodies are, and that Israel has shared it with the US. But what has Hamas's argument been for the delay? And in terms of bringing additional equipment, let's say, and manpower from Egypt as well?
So Hamas's response since the first day is, we do not have the tools, we do not have the equipment, we do not have the resources. And we have been seeing this every single day since the war started, where a family would be buried under the rubble and no one would be able to reach them. So Hamas has been calling over and over again for more equipment, for heavy machinery. And since the day and the minute this heavy machinery entered the Gaza Strip, the efforts of retrieving the bodies started. The digging started, and we have been seeing the fact that Hamas has been collaborating with the Red Cross. They gave the coordinates, they allocated where these bodies are, but we're talking about very, very big efforts that need to be taken. We talked to the civil defense teams, and civil defense teams said that one body buried under the rubble could take more than 12 hours of search and digging and able to be retrieved. So it's a very harsh reality on the ground. It's not only about the Israeli captives' bodies, but we're also talking about at least 9,000 of Palestinians that are still trapped under the rubble, and they're missing, and no one knows where they are. So at least they know where they are. They have been allocating, and Hamas knows, and they have been telling the Palestinians that this effort is going to be done because they want the new phase of this ceasefire. They want the reconstruction, they want the opening of Rafah crossing, and they also want the ceasefire to get rooted on the ground. Now, there has been a lot of efforts by Hamas, and we have been seeing this on the ground, where they have been helping to retrieve those bodies of the Israeli captives. But again, If those bodies won't be handed today, this is going to make the situation more challenging, and more obstacles are going to be facing the Palestinians, especially during this very hard time.
Yeah, I mean, Trump certainly has somewhat contradicted himself in some of the statements he's made. He did back up Hamas, saying that, of course, it's a very difficult task to try and find those bodies, many of them perhaps stuck in tunnels deep underground. But at the same time, he said that they wouldn't hesitate to allow Israel to do what it needs to ensure that Hamas doesn't violate the ceasefire. Of course, in the last few days, as we have seen bodies of captives being removed and handed over to Israel, we've also been seeing, as part of the ceasefire deal, a return of Palestinian bodies, but many of them desecrated, it seems.
Sarah, this is a whole heartbreaking story. We went there and we saw those bodies, and we saw the unidentified, unrecognized bodies, where Palestinian families were even unable to recognize who is who, and if they have any relationship to those who have been handed over to the Palestinian side from the Israeli side. We have been seen signs of torture, hands with ropes, blindfolded, and doctors are saying that it's very, very hard to recognize these bodies due to the amount of torture the Palestinians have been witnessing as they were caught by the Israeli forces. We went there 2 days ago. We smelled how these bodies smelled. It was a very bad smell, but this shows how many days those Palestinian bodies have been held without anyone identifying them or recognizing them. We're talking about thousands of others still missing, Sarah. Their families do not know who they are, and we see people going to this mass grave, visiting those without knowing if their children or their beloved ones are those or are part of their family members. This story has been affecting every single Palestinian, because this may be one of their family members, this may be one of their relatives, their friends, and not being able to recognize who this person is actually heartbreaking. And this shows how Palestinians are being tortured even after they have been killed by the Israeli forces.
Yeah, a very difficult time for Palestinians all round as well. Thank you very much, Hind Khoudary, for that update from Deir el-Balah. That's in the central part of the Strip. And from there, let's go to Copenhagen, where Mohammed Shehada is a political analyst from Gaza and a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. What are your immediate thoughts when you hear this statement coming out of Israel?
Well, basically, Netanyahu, from the very start of the ceasefire, has been trying to find any trick possible to resume the genocide in Gaza. We see this with Israel refusing to open up the Rafah border crossing, with restricting until this moment the amount of aid that's going in, and with Lebanonizing Gaza, continuing these bombardments here and there, despite the ceasefire being in place under bogus and unsubstantiated claims. So Netanyahu, a week ago, when a similar incident occurred in Rafah, the Israelis understood immediately that it was either their own troops running over an unexploded ordnance, or it might have been some Hamas militants that have no contact, no connection whatsoever to the leadership, to the chain of command and control, and no knowledge even of the ceasefire taking place, because those are people hiding in tunnels. But Israel capitalized on this immediately to drop on that day over 150 tons of bombs on Gaza immediately and killed over 40 people. So we see the same thing playing now again and again and again. It's basically Netanyahu testing boundaries with Trump and trying to build up a case for resuming the genocide in Gaza.
That's a very interesting point you make there about testing boundaries, because the US Trump administration, including the special envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, both of them had been visiting the Middle East, making it very clear that they want this deal to go ahead. Of course, it's still in the very early stages. We haven't even got to the second stage. How can this continue if Israel also will be violating the ceasefire?
Precisely. Israel, Netanyahu in particular, has inserted a number of loopholes in the ceasefire agreement that would ensure his ability to collapse it or to violate it at every turn. For example, take the issue of the dead hostages, the bodies in Gaza. Hamas delivered over half of the bodies that are there. They cannot locate the rest of them, and they made that clear throughout the negotiations. In fact, Israel's own Mossad chief said in January this year, 10 months ago, that finding those bodies will be virtually impossible because of 50 million tons of rubble. But Israel has been exploiting this to say that Hamas is violating the ceasefire agreement, and therefore we should not abide by it as well. We see also Netanyahu constantly complaining about Hamas not leaving government in Gaza and not disarming, while at the same time preventing the Palestinian Authority 5,500 trained policemen that have been trained in Egypt and Jordan. He outright rejected the Egyptian intelligence chief request to allow those policemen into Gaza to take over the government from Hamas. He also refused to allow troops from Turkey, Qatar, and other countries to go into Gaza and assist in finding the bodies of hostages or to be a stabilizing mission on the ground. So the Israeli side is, until this moment, trying everything possible to create loopholes, to create explosive mines on the road to ending the genocide in order to collapse the agreement. This morning, Israel's own Channel 14, the most pro-Netanyahu TV channel, they were saying very openly that the only reason why Israel agreed to this was, number one, getting the hostages out, number two, to get some time to repair the equipment, the vehicles, the tanks, in order to resume the genocide at full force again. So it's, for them, they made it clear it's only a matter of time before they manufacture a worthy pretext that allows a green light from the White House to resume the bombardment of Gaza.
And, you just mentioned some of the other countries that are involved. There's the so-called International Stabilization Force, also known as ISF. It would be made up of regional countries. When Trump was asked very frankly by a reporter a couple of days ago, he didn't still seem to know who would be part of that force exactly. But what was made clear is that Israel would have a say in that.
Israel is trying everything possible to prevent the creation of that force. Until now, most of the names that came up, for example, Turkey, Qatar, or Egypt, or others, the Israelis have been vetoing them systematically. It's just a tactic to buy time, to exhaust Trump. Netanyahu knows that Trump's attention span is very short, and his hope is that Trump would be distracted by the next big topic and move on from Gaza and give him a free hand again. So it's only a tactic to buy time, a maneuver first and last.
Mohammed, when you take a look at the situation now Israel says it's going to carry out these strikes. The US perhaps may turn a blind eye to it this time. What effects would this have on people in Gaza just as they're about to pick up their lives, at least try to, and return to their homes?
Well, for the last 2 weeks, I've been trying desperately to get hold of family and friends in Gaza to see if the ceasefire has made any difference. It did not, because of the looming threat of the resumption of the genocide. They are still in this survival mode, this hyped up adrenaline, this panic attack constantly. My friends, their kids are constantly having seizures and panic attacks and night terrors in their sleep. So the nightmare is still there. And Israel makes sure to emphasize it to people every day with this endless buzzing noise of predator drones on top of their heads. Each of those drones is equipped to shoot to kill. And the drones are covering literally every single inch of Gaza. It's something of a sci-fi horror movie. You have, at the same time, Israel has been, from the very start of the ceasefire, bombing people that come in close proximity to an invisible yellow line that has divided Gaza like the Berlin Wall, with even deadlier consequences. It divided Gaza in two halves, taking away all of the agricultural lands, Gaza's food basket, and giving it to Israel and keeping it depopulated, and squeezing 2 million people in the rest of Gaza. For people there, they say the genocide is not over. For instance, if you take a look at the ability to get any sort of decent shelter, it is virtually non-existent. From the very start of the ceasefire, Israel has not been allowing any tents or prefabricated homes or caravans. So I keep getting on my phone constant phone calls from friends and family in Gaza, literally begging for any kind of shelter whatsoever, especially now with the winter approaching. The first question that people ask each other is your home still standing? Can I please just move into your home if it's still standing? And virtually every single person I know had their homes bombed, burned to the ground, detonated, bulldozed, or destroyed beyond the ability to house any human life. But you still have the secondary question, is some of your homes still standing? I have friends and family that are staying in bombed buildings, in the rubble, trying to burrow out between the destroyed parts of the building and try to find as much room as possible to squeeze in and wrap around the pillars of the destroyed buildings with plastic and make it into a temporary shelter. This is how desperate they are. And Israel is very invested into keeping that half of Gaza as uninhabitable as possible. So the genocide just took an attritional form where violence is spread across time and space, that it becomes almost invisible, but it is very visible to people on the ground.
All right, thank you very much, Mohammed Shehada there, a political analyst from Gaza and also speaking to us from Copenhagen.
Don't miss out. Get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news, expert insight. Like, share, stay ahead.